Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Forum Online. We're grateful to have you. Grace Cathedral's vision is a more spiritually alive world. Whether it's meditation or a walk in nature, reading a sacred text, or saying a prayer, there are many ways to tap into a heightened awareness of the world around you and your place in it. But how does that happen? Are we universally equipped with a capacity for spirituality? Does spirituality help us become more resilient? What is the science of spirituality, and how can we best engage it in our lives? My guest tonight is Dr. Lisa Miller, the New York Times bestselling author of The Spiritual Child, which is this book right here. Very, very loved book. It's even starting to yellow. The pages are yellowing on the side. Show that it's been especially appreciated. And also The Awakened Brain. So this is her latest book. Lisa is professor and founder of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute at Columbia University. For over a decade, she has held a joint appointment in the Department of Psychiatry at the Columbia Medical School. She's a leading national expert in spirituality, health, and thriving. As we continue our exploration of the Cathedral's theme of healing this year, we're going to be talking tonight about the neuroscience of spirituality and a bold new paradigm for health, healing, and resilience. I'm so glad to see you, Lisa. You must have been smiling because when I got up to shut the door, you saw that I was wearing shorts, that I was wearing my suit on the top, shorts on the bottom. It's so hot in San Francisco during September, and that's what I did. So I'm going to come clean with everybody
Malcolm,
else.
I'm smiling because it's so good to see you again. I think it's been 4 or 5 years since I was at Grace in person, and it was such a memorable and meaningful time together. I felt your community is so full of love and inclusion. It's truly a spiritual community.
And you're so sweet. And it was October 16th, 2016. And I feel the same way about you. I think you're one of my favorite forum guests. Your personality and your love and your ministry, really. You're out there on the front lines, really doing such important work. And I'm so grateful for you. That's why I was so glad for The Awakened Brain, because I felt like I had a lot of questions after reading The Spiritual Child, and The Awakened Brain kind of helped me to fit those little pieces together that I didn't know all about. And I know ever since reading that section about your experiences on the New York subway, every time in a public light, I put up my phone in my pocket and I start looking at the faces of the people around me, and they're giving so much. Unintentionally, they're telling me so much with just how they're looking, with their facial expressions. And I've been thinking so much about your experience there on the subway. But my first question is just like the most obvious question. And that is, here we are, we're kind of coming out of COVID. We're kind of in COVID still. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what we learned, both about mental health and spirituality, just during this whole adventure this experiment that we've been in together.
Right. Well, Malcolm, I think that you're right, that this really, because it is such an unprecedented time, had, of course, a lot of suffering, a lot of isolation, real isolation, despair, fear, uncertainty. But in those times of real suffering, we had an opportunity to hit the brakes and look at life more deeply. And very often, if you ask people, okay, what did you lose? Right. And hopefully it was not a person they loved, but they'll say, well, I lost, if it's a young person, prom, or I lost graduation, or an adult might say, we lost the opportunity to celebrate Thanksgiving. That's what was lost. What was gained? Well, dad came home at night, or mom came home at night, or we really listened to each other at dinner and made eye contact. What did you lose? What did you gain? What did you discover? And here was where, because we had effectively surprise retreat, a time of great solitude, we effectively walked into the labyrinth and shed our usual busyness, our run on the treadmill, our habitual thoughts, and spending that all sort of over time on this forced retreat was loosened, and we let go of a lot. And there in the center of the labyrinth, we have a choice, having reached this deeper look into life. How are we going to reemerge as we start to swirl our way back out of the labyrinth? And that's a question that right now we face as this unwinds. How are we going to show up for each other, knowing what we now know? A bit wiser, far more compassionate, aware that the old way of living that was pretty ramped up didn't work. Certainly not alone. In the Awakened Brain, I talk about how so very often, and I saw this when I was out on the road with the spiritual child, there was a constant tendency to use what I call achieving awareness, tactical, strategic thinking. A young child is told, you get A's, you go to UCLA. If you want to, you can go to divinity school, you can go to medical school. An adult says, if I just get this promotion and that, I can move over 3 blocks, I'll have a nicer house. This sort of constant planning, strategizing. Well, we saw that the nature of life is far more full of flux, far more dynamic, far more out of our narrow control. And when life shows us something so splendidly disorienting, we have the opportunity to loosen our grip on narrow, strategic, really illusory control, achieving awareness, and bring in a complementary form of awareness, which I call awakened awareness. It's, of course, spiritual awareness, a deeper look into life. This is our chance, perhaps a generational opportunity, the chance of our lifetimes to be far more compassionate and connected, far more aware of life's deeper, truer nature. And if we're really smart, raise our young adults and children to understand that you do not control life. You are not the grand maker. You are a pilot who navigates the skies. You are a surfer who gets curious about the waves, but you don't control the world. Learn to be in dialogue, an awakened connection with the world.
Yeah, that's so true. And I just finished reading Sartre and Surfing, the book by the UC Irvine professor. And you're right. I mean, when you're, right now we're having like the best surf of the year. I mean, September, October in San Francisco this is the place to be. And right now, Ocean Beach is serving up like huge surf, and it's so clean and so perfect. But you're right, you're not in charge of those waves, and they're so much more powerful than you. But by making just kind of like slight little adjustments in terms of like front weighting your front foot, or putting weight on your back foot, like leaning forward into the board, just like these slight little like gestures just have this enormous effect, because the power of the surf is what's kind of pushing you through towards shore. And you're so right. I think part of what happens for me is I just feel a lot closer to God after this, because I just feel like that at any moment of our day, God is more available to me than maybe I felt when I was in that treadmill that you described so eloquently.
And as you suggest so beautifully, of course, God's always there, right? But our awareness, our choice of perception, we can use our mind, our endowment, our brain in many different ways. And it is choice to put our hand on the gear shift and choose to look into flux and uncertainty with an open, curious, loving presence, to look, what is life showing me now? What is God saying to us here?
Yeah.
This is the opening of a great dialogue.
Yes, exactly. And I think part of it is that we've learned too, that there's ways of being together that we may have dismissed before. Like I hate whenever I've said, we're having a virtual such and such. It's not virtual. It's a real meeting. It's not a virtual meeting. It's not a pretend meeting. It's the real thing. It's just, and we do share with ourselves, and it's possible for us to care for one another through these new media that we may have discounted more beforehand. But there's no need for anybody to be alone anymore. I just think of, my grandparents lived in a very remote town in Iowa, and there weren't any, their religion was different than everybody. There's 5 Dutch Reformed churches in this town, right? So if you were Dutch Reformed, it was the perfect place to be. But I mean, if you weren't Dutch Reformed, there was nothing really else that you had. Whereas now, I could imagine, them, coming to Grace Cathedral online every day, being part of our morning prayer or evening prayer, and they would be connected, and they'd be part of that community. So there is this.
Malcolm, I have to tell you, my ancestors were in Iowa.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they were the only people of their faith
I
tradition.
can imagine that.
So
Yeah,
this is
exactly.
quite an alignment, a
Yes,
synchronicity, which is
Pella, Iowa, which is not, I mean, it's like everybody knows about Pella because where the windows come from there. But yeah, that's where they died. That's where I buried them. That's where I did their funerals for them. And it would be such a different world now there's so many lonely people in nursing homes, et cetera. And there's just no need for that anymore, you know?
It's true.
And, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, you're getting to this point that you're engaging technology in a way, as you put it so beautifully, so that we never are alone. And I call that, through the lens of science, relational spirituality. What is our possibility for being wholly present to one another? How are you seeing so differently when, I shared right before we got on with your team that I could walk in having never met anyone into Grace, and I could bring 3 people from the subway with me, and we would all be greeted with love. We would all be greeted with interest. We would all immediately be members of your community. I think what you do so beautifully at Grace is that you see each of us as souls on earth. You see each of us as beings of not just inherent worth, but as emanations of God or spirit of life itself. That is not how, through the lens of achieving awareness, people tend to be seen. If I sit down at a dinner party, I'm asked what I do, where I live. I feel this calculus running, a little calculator is being punched, trying to, place me on a grid. I walk into Grace, and it doesn't matter if I was on the front page yesterday for making $5 million or robbing a bank and going to jail. You look at me with love because I've come to be redeemed and renewed and love. That is who we can be to one another if we focus, as you do at Grace, walk out the door 24/7, work towards being people who bring out not just the best, but the deep soul in one another, seeing each other into full existence. So that's a form of relational spirituality that we are built for. But that bicep is way undercultivated, I think, in mainstream culture. At Grace, you build that bicep. And the lift, we needed the lift this year. And because you built the bicep, people were uplifted. Can we keep that strength and fitness going? We need physical fitness for the physical core. We need spiritual fitness for the spiritual core. Practice seeing each other into full existence. Keep the bicep strong.
Yeah, and you're so right. And there is this sense of the cathedral, that there's a part of the culture which is like a culture of hospitality. It's like those ushers and greeters and normal people, they know that the cathedral doesn't just exist for a small group of people in the way that a church might, that just where the same people come every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. But it really exists for whoever is here, wherever they are, whatever their spiritual practice or belief or lack of belief, and it's something I really, really love. And we have a huge number of tourists. That's one of the things I miss the most. Is there's people from South America and people from Japan and people from East Africa. I really miss seeing all those visitors that we have.
And you look at all of us as we walk in, no matter whether we came from one corner or the other of the earth, as souls on earth, that we are magnificently diverse and we are one.
Yes. Exactly.
And this form of knowing is awakened awareness. This idea that, it's actually, if it's not TMI on the science side, the parietal part of our brain puts in and out hard boundaries. And we are able to simultaneously see that we are wonderfully unique and come from all over and have a different zipped up bio bodysuit. And at the very same time, share a powerful common human heart, the same seat of human awareness and experience. That commonality, we're a point in a wave, we're distinct and we're one, is so alive and well at Grace. Relational spirituality, it's a form of awakened awareness. I call it the awakened heart. If I might, it's so interesting, Malcolm. Again, cut me off if it's too much science, but we see in the MRI that of all the forms of lived human spiritual life, that which has the greatest impact on the spiritual brain, if you will, that which builds the bicep, marked by cortical thickness across the regions of the spiritual use of our brain. So the bicep gets strong when we look at each other with love of neighbor, when we act out of altruism, when we do at once experience that maybe I'm in a plight and you're here to help me. And tomorrow you may be in a difficult situation and I want to be there for you. That unitive sense of love marked by an awareness of today you're in a sticky place or tomorrow I am, the difference in the oneness, that is one of the most optimal uses of our brain we have. It is, I call it the awakened heart. What it is building processing power, cortical thickness, across regions of the parietal, occipital, precuneus, these regions of the awakened brain that allow us on the very next day, using the very same equipment, to feel closer to God, him or herself.
Yeah.
So the same brain that brings us close to see God in one another is the same use of the brain that literally directly feels the transcendent relationship with our highest power.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things, just to, for those of us who are watching and may not have read the book yet, but the experiment is basically with a long-term group of people who've provided survey data, so we know kind of what their orientation towards spirituality and religion is, and then comparing the MRIs. That was kind of the first breakthrough, and then the next breakthrough was really to talk, to kind of induce a kind of spiritual experience while they were in the MRI, and to see how that connected with other kinds of mental functioning, mental states. And the MRI machine, I just had my first MRI last week, and it's an extraordinary invention. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just its assets and limitations, and then what technologies you're seeing kind of going forward. There's going to be, I think there's a lot of room for breakthroughs in this study of spirituality, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that after that.
Wonderful. Malcolm, first of all, thank you for reading every word of the book. Thank you. And actually, in the back of the book, in the way back, are references. So you can pull up original articles. The Awakened Brain has in the back hundreds of studies. So you can go on Medline or Google Scholar and see the actual study itself. I'm going to speak in aggregate, maybe highlighting a few core studies, if that's okay.
You did a great job with the footnotes, by the way. They're not obtrusive and still very helpful.
Thank you, Malcolm. So first of all, let me take your precious opportunity to say, very often I hear from people, I am not so spiritual. I believe in science, or I'm very spiritual. And this sounds unscientific. But in truth, spirituality and science go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And science is merely a lens. Whether we're talking about genotyping or MRI studies or long-term clinical course studies or a microscope or a telescope, science is a lens. And we can take that lens and point it at just about anything, any meaningful question across a very broad range of inquiry, including the impact of spirituality in the human life. So the Awakened Brain and the references in the back have to do with a body of science now robust, nearly 25 years cumulatively of science, that looks at the extraordinary impact of lived human spirituality on the rest of our lives. And the major point that I want to put right out front is that when we build the bicep, if you will, when we cultivate and strengthen our awakened awareness, our spiritual core, we are healthier. How much healthier? We are 80% at decreased risk for addiction, 60% at decreased risk for major depression. And as you know, what is the epidemic of our time? A young adult is more likely to die by suicide than by auto accident. It's the number one killer of young adults. A young adult is 82% less likely to commit suicide if he or she has a strong spirituality that is shared. And we go right back to the inclusive, loving, looking at one another with love as souls on earth, the moment I walk in the door to grace. Right? There is nothing as profoundly protective against the diseases of despair, the killers of our young right now, than a strong personal spirituality, and that it might be shared. That is what the science shows. So having established that, what do we mean by spirituality? And among the many threads of lived human spirituality, a direct connection, a transcendent relationship to God, some say Jesus, Hashem, Allah, the universe, but a deep felt transcendent relationship, and that it might be shared, are the two threads of human lived spirituality that have the most powerful impact on the rest of our lives and ameliorate suffering are the threshold and the power in and through us for renewal when we face trauma. They are our greatest source of perception. Not only are we armored against subsequent rounds of suffering, but life is far more vast. So this is what, you know well, Malcolm, science mirrors that which you know. Science mirrors that which people who follow the spiritual path know. But science can be very empowering because it offers a roadmap for how to help one another and help ourselves.
Yeah, and science also, I think it, it's funny. I love that you chose the labyrinth as your metaphor when we began talking. The quick story of the labyrinth is that Lauren Artress was working at Grace Cathedral, and it was the AIDS crisis. And it was just, she got so overextended, she absolutely couldn't function anymore. And so she needed something else to change direction. She needed to take on another project. And so what she was looking for was a form of spiritual practice that didn't have any dogma attached to it, that anybody just walking off the street, you don't have to believe anything in order to walk the labyrinth. And so she took a group of clergy to Chartres Cathedral, and there were a bunch of chairs on the floor. So they took all the chairs off the floor and began walking that labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral. And almost every modern labyrinth in the world is connected to this labyrinth because of that work of letting people know about what labyrinths could be in terms of spiritual practices. But and what science does in part is you're right, it's a lens, right? So there's a lot more, we know a lot more about defense technologies than we know about, ending poverty for children in Africa because of where the money is. So it's got that lens element, but it also has that shared, that thing that's shared for us. So that objectivity around a particular issue means that it can be kind of a lingua franca for us. So it does.
And I find it interesting, Malcolm, your use that the labyrinth became almost universal around the world. It's so interesting because there is within us, we are hardwired with a universal, just like there's in every human being, the capacity for language. We're not born a blank slate. We're not a tabula rasa. We come knowers when it comes to readiness to speak a language. So too, we become on day one, when we are born, every child on earth is born a spiritual child. If we look through the lens of twin studies, twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factor out the degree of commonality as a function of shared genes and shared environment.
Right.
Every one of us is born with an innate capacity for a transcendent relationship with God, the higher power, whatever word we use. And that is not merely a belief or a theory. That is a seat of perception marked in MRI studies by very specific circuits in the brain with which we are all endowed. Those are the docking stations of the transcendent awareness with which we are gifted from day one. So that means if we all around the world have an innate capacity for spiritual awareness, there must be common phenotypes. There are things that all around the world affect us and move us spiritually in the same way. Religion is a beautiful, rich embrace of our natural spirituality. Religion is the gift of our leaders, our clergy, our grandparents and parents, our community. And no matter what faith tradition may be ours, it is embracing the same universal spiritual core. So first of all, that makes religious war look very obsolete because we have one spiritual brain all around the world. But second of all, we see common deep spiritual perceptions. We looked in India, we looked in China, we looked in a host of countries, including the United States. And all around the world, we see awakened awareness. We see transcendent awareness, whether or not someone has had the opportunity to freely express or deeply engage their spiritual core.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting. And I mean, and one of the things I keep thinking about is just kind of from in a therapeutic context. I love the story about you basically hosting a Yom Kippur. I read it on Yom Kippur too. Wasn't that great? I mean, it was so, that synchronicity is like a perfect day to read it.
It's quite a synchronicity.
Isn't
The
that
chance
funny?
is only 1 in 365.
Exactly.
That's quite
Completely of all days to run across that paragraph. But I wonder just if there, and I think about it for Grace Cathedral often. So we're trying to come up with those kinds of rituals that help nourish the spiritual brain of people who are not Christian. And so one of the things we have is sound bath. We have this thing called Grace Light, which is kind of like an experience of light. Being in a cathedral, those large pillars, there's something just very elevating color of the light through the stained glass windows. But we really are thinking about like, how can you engage that awakened brain in people who have just barriers between them and in Christian faith in particular, but organized religion in general, But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like, is there a team of psychologists who are like looking for like rituals that they may enact in a therapeutic context to help heal people in the way that you saw the healing happening after that Yom Kippur service?
So, it's so interesting that you say that, Malcolm, because something you're already doing, I'm sure, has an enormous awakening impact on all who hear your voice, which is stories of the presence of God, our higher power, spirit in our lives, our high pixel information. Right? And we have found that from a scientific lens, in the formation of the spiritual core, in the cultivating of awakened awareness, there's an equal contribution of transparency by a spiritual religious teacher, parent, grandparent, pastor, priest, imam, no matter who they are, if they are transparent and authentic about their own spiritual experience, if they tell stories that are true from their heart, that is profoundly awakening. It literally wakes up our own spiritual awareness. And equally, as well as talking and sharing of the truth, is walking the walk, embodying spiritual values. And when we look at this person we admire, Malcolm, so many people admire you, our pastor, priest, and imam, our grandparent, parent. When we look at this person and they live day-to-day spiritual values that align with the messages that they're teaching, there is an enormous transformative process on all of us, but particularly the teen, the child, the young adult, but on all of us. And it is the path to reawakening. As you know, AA often runs on this. It's effectively, through invoking a spiritual community that people are reawakened. 2/3 of people to recover from addiction through AA report doing so through a spiritual awakening. AA instantiates a community where we are loved, seen, held, and never left alone.
One of the biggest questions I have is I have no idea if this is true or not, but there is a sense when I'm praying that it's not like the words come. So I definitely have a practice of, a meditation, passage meditation, right? So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want, et cetera, et cetera. But there's almost a kind of feeling that's kind of beyond the words of just a divine presence. And that's one example of just, and I don't know how to describe it. The other is that there have been moments when, and it's even been like interpersonal moments, like, I'm going running, and something happens, like an interaction between me and somebody who's passing the other direction. And as they go past, I almost feel this, like, it's almost like the back of my head just,
Yes.
But I don't know if that's made up. Do you know what I mean?
No. We track that with our MRIs and EEGs,
Okay.
exactly as you share. So beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. So the first sharing that in this state of connection to God and in prayer, if there are 9 people in prayer and the 10th person walks in the room, he or she more quickly moves into a state of deep transcendent connection with God or their higher power.
Yeah.
And that is tracked by the rapidity with which they adapt the mirror neurons of everyone else in the room. So we are effectively, you might say, antennas or holding a field of life, but that sacred presence in and through you is very rapidly, as you hold that, moving through others as well. And we track that with entrainment, or if you will say matching, quickly aligning patterns that become uniform amongst all the people in the group. The second piece, which is so beautiful, is that when we look at people who are in a deep state of spiritual connection, they give off exactly where you point. And this is a spot where many traditions cover their head. Right? They give off from the back of their head, posterior, high amplitude alpha, a wavelength that we can track with EEGs. And high amplitude alpha marks the engagement of the spiritual brain, of awakened awareness. High amplitude alpha goes by another name in another field, same wavelength. It's Schumann's resonance, and it's the wavelength of life from the Earth's crust up 1 mile, creation. So the spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the same wavelength of all life, nature. The felt sense of oneness is a real sense of oneness.
And the other thing I think about it is just setting some kind of time or space or habit around that. Just it's funny. I interviewed a woman who's like a spiritual leader in India, and when she talks about, well, first of all, she says flat out, she says, like, I'm not having a Hindu experience, I'm a Jewish experience. It's just like an experience of God, and it's just like those other things are kind of added on afterwards to try to make sense of it. But when she describes having a religious experience, it is completely resonates with me. I have the same things that are happening, but it's almost like I have to make it comes more often if I make some kind of space in my life for it, if I do something to be inviting. But I don't know.
That's the conditions, right? I mean, we don't command the
exactly. I can't say I'm going to have God's going to be present,
right?
Yeah.
But Malcolm, it's so interesting that you highlight the deep common experience of God, no matter how we tell it or how we get there. Because when we looked through the MRI at people who were Christian, Catholic, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, no matter what their faith tradition, no matter what their way into transcendent awareness or what words they might use to describe it, the same neurocorrelates run. We asked 18 through 25-year-olds in New Haven, tell us a time where you felt a deep connection to God, the universe, Jesus, Hashem, Allah. Tell us a time where maybe you were struggling and suddenly you felt God's presence, the presence of life itself. And again, no matter whether they were spiritual but not religious, or from any broad, any number of one broad range of faith traditions, we looked at the same patterns in the MRI, and they involved 4 networks that I think mirror experience that is indeed universal. The first is that we quiet the racket. We disengage the default network. That's just shared in common with mindfulness. It's quieting down the rumination.
Right.
Why did he say that to me?
Thoughts that think us instead of us thinking our thoughts. Yeah, the rumination's that whole discussion that you had is of just people cycling through these destructive thoughts is, yeah. And then, yeah, like you're right.
But then once we do get present, mindful, we are at the threshold. This is really mindfulness plus beyond mindfulness. We can move into a state of spiritual awareness, what I'm calling awaken awareness. And that involves, just as we were held as children in our parents' arms, the bonding network is engaged and we feel loved and held. And we know that God or life is holding us. We are buoyant. We will not fall through existence. Right? The parietal, putting in and out hard boundaries, we are aware that we are not alone, that we are never alone. And that you're sitting in San Francisco and I'm here outside New York, but we have a deep common seat, a common human heart, a common form of human experience, which means that we can connect as souls on earth and care. And then finally, instead of, I've got to have it, I laid out my plans. I was going to go to med school. I had straight A's in all the sciences, but then I was just turned down at 4 out of 5 med schools. Yeah. How could that be? A plus B plus C. She was about to say yes. We were going to get married and it all fell apart. Somehow it seemed so in the bag, so strategically and tactically laid out, fell apart. That red door that seemed so sure was stuck. You can't get out. So I can hit my head against the red door, employing the dorsal top-down attention network, or through spiritual awareness, through prayer, through being open and present, creating the conditions to be close to God, my higher power. I can drop that narrow top-down dorsal attention network, move to the bottom up ventral, and suddenly see a host of possibilities, far more information. And many people say that the true, genuine path pops. The yellow door just opened up. I would have never thought of the yellow door. I was over here banging my head on the red door. To have pivoted 112 degrees, that only happened because I moved into a state of awakened awareness, and there God guided me to see the yellow door, bottom-up attention network. So between these four networks, we see and know that we are loved, held, guided, and that we are never alone. That is universal spiritual awareness: loved, held, guided, and never alone. Remember the two threads of spiritual life that are game-changing on all other realms of our lives: that we see the presence of the transcendent, loved, held, guided, and never alone, and that we show up for one another so that we are towards others loving, holding, guiding, and that we should never leave anyone alone. And that is what you do at Grace.
Yeah.
I walk in, I am not alone. So those two threads, you are effectively an awakened activist. You create awakened action. And this is the science mirroring that we are built to be ignited as living in deep relationship with God and as in showing up and seeing God's presence in one another.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, when Jesus asked for the summary of the law, it's, he's completely talking about his Orthodox Jewish heritage when he says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. And the second commandment is like it unto it: love thy neighbor as thyself. And that is, I think it's so interesting too, there's like two different modes. And one mode is just like, how do you help people to be like more connected to that awakened brain? And then the other mode is just like, how can we learn more about it? So that it may be more available, when we understand it better. One of the things I thought so much about since I'm reading The Spiritual Child is just, you took it on the road. And I wonder like what you've learned since writing The Spiritual Child, just in terms of your understanding of the spirituality of children.
Wow. So Malcolm, I was very moved to see how parents had always sensed in their heart that their children were profoundly spiritual. And many parents said to me, I didn't believe in anything, but then my daughter was born, or then my son was born, and I knew there was something more, and I knew that God existed, whatever their word may be.
Right, exactly.
So that the child is an opening. The child is divine presence. The child, if you will, reboots the parent's spirituality. And this is perhaps the greatest thing I saw. And I thought I'd be on the road 2 or 3 months. I was on the road 3 years with The Spiritual Child. And what I realized was there was such hunger to love and know and help our children cultivate their spiritual heart. Parents were passionate about that. But where the tears really flowed during the Q&A sessions, where, the arms went up really high and parents looked a little unglued, they'd say, am I spiritual? And that's why I wrote The Awakened Brain, because yes, every single one of us is spiritual. We are born as spiritual beings.
That's what I say all the time. Yeah. And no matter how many, the statistics don't work anymore, but for a long time, the mainline churches were in decline, like substantial decline in terms of the number of participants. And the last statistic said the mainline churches are like 2% increase or whatever. But regardless of what you think about the statistics, human beings are spiritual creatures. I say that all the time. And it's just a question of, are you going to create the kind of structures and the kind of institutions and the kind of communities that are going to be able to nurture that, or you're not going to be able to do it? Like, because everything, the faith, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, it has to be the church or the temple for that time. Do you mean there's certain parts of it that are kind of universal through history, but there's certain things that we just have to figure out what's appropriate for our time. And I had one of the most powerful experiences with your book. I basically did a kind of a summary of your book for, we have a boys' school at the cathedral, and I did it for parents at the boys' school. And it was a really powerful moment, because those are those parents. Remember, you talk about the students that are struggling in the awakened brain, the ones who come from very privileged backgrounds. You know, we have some students who are not from privilege, some who are from privilege, but the privileged ones were the ones who talked to me afterwards. It's just about, what do you do when you have this generation of children, and they really do think that the love their parents have is conditional upon their achievements, and, you know, in sports or in school or what have you.
Yeah, Malcolm, the suffering, well, this is how I think about it. I think 40 years ago, in the good attempt to be inclusive, we made a huge mistake as a society. We threw all talk of religion out of the public square. And with that went the spiritual baby with the bathwater. And over 2 generations, we now have many young adults. And Malcolm, I work with the Army, I work in higher education, I work with the private sector in entry-level jobs. We have young adults who have never been more fragile, who have never had such suffering in their lives. You know, there have never been such high rates of depression, addiction, and suicidality as we now face now, right now, all of us across the United States. This is not the Army's problem. This is not the higher education community's problem. This is our American challenge. And the solution is exactly what you're doing at Grace, which is to put the spiritual bathwater and baby back together again and be inclusive. Allow people to express their spiritual heart in a way that is authentic, but invite people into a spiritual community that welcomes them no matter where they are in their path, and perhaps from wherever they may have come. This effectively has weighed on the young people more than any other generation. So it affects us all of every decade. But young adults, you know, I hear in my 2 years of working with the Army, we can't conduct basic training the way we used to anymore, because if you tear someone down, there's nothing there, there's no core. And they can't hold, right? Higher education, on my own campus at Columbia University, we had 9 publicly acknowledged suicides in 1 year.
Right, I knew that. Yeah. No, it is. That's exactly what I feel too. It's just like, it's just in the same way that, I mean, 2,000 people died of COVID yesterday. Like, it's just, I mean, and, you know, the statistics that you mentioned in the very beginning of the book about the number of people who are suffering from depression, the number of people, like 31% of adults are going to have anxiety, some kind of anxiety disorder. I mean, these statistics, and like you said, they're skewed they're worse for the younger generations.
But you know, what we see, this is where there's hope, which is between middle to late adolescence into emerging adulthood, there is a surge, literally a biological clock goes off, marked by a hunger for existential quest. What is my meaning? What is the meaning written into life? A hunger of the heart to connect, illumination. This is hardwired spiritual emergence. It's, you know, whether or not we ever knew it was coming. So we have the opportunity to help late adolescents and emerging adults in this moment of great possibility. In this moment, you know, through twin studies, we see a 50% increase in the heritable contribution, which means they are primed. They're synaptogenous. Help me, you know, please, teacher, show up. And if no teacher shows up, the young adult can spiral downward. There is no meaning. There is no purpose. The young adult can go shopping and find bad teachers, right? So we've got to show up for young adults. And whether it is in high school or in college, or in the Army, our institutions need to change to support the spiritual core. It may not have been incumbent upon us 40 years ago, but in order to have a whole, healthy, functioning young adult, we need to now institutionally support the formation of the spiritual core. We need to cultivate in a way that's pluralistic and inclusive or universal awakened awareness, spiritual awareness. And we do this at Columbia, and I'm doing this now in the Army, and you're doing this at Grace. This is our job, because this is going to save their lives.
Yeah, I completely believe that. I just believe people are so much more strong and resilient when they have this connection to the holy. You know, one of the
every bit of data mirrors that. Every bit of data, hundreds of peer review articles, 80% less likely to be addicted, 60% less likely to be depressed, 82% less likely to take their lives. And on the upside, more resilient, more optimistic. So we're not only just armored against pathology, but when we build awakened awareness, when we cultivate in young adults their spiritual awareness, life is far more robust. It is far more full of magnificent surprises. They're more able to make commitments to one another because they see that each other as brothers and sisters, not the shallow, competitive lens of achieving awareness. You got that 96 and I got an 82. That's not much of a relationship.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm sure I must have asked you, but I don't remember your response. But about the internet, I mean, and just its effect on younger people. I wonder if you can speak to that. If your thinking is changing, or if you have any pointers too for both parents and for young people who are trying to decide what role to have in their devices have in their life.
Well, I think you put it beautifully that the internet can be used in an intentional, thoughtful way to bring us together in common purpose in spiritual community. So it's about our choice of how we engage the internet.
Yeah, definitely.
But at the same time, excuse me 1 second. At the same time, constant distraction. I'm looking to see if mine is here. Use of the phone.
Yeah.
I can mark this with science. We looked at 3 generations of people to cultivate their spiritual experience and then put on an EEG cap for us. And what we saw in what is now the grandparents' generation is that as young adults, they had long moments of reflection, prayer. Many of them were part of a faith tradition. And in late adolescence, emerging adulthood, formed the seat of awakened awareness, transcendent awareness, and gave off for the rest of their lives high amplitude alpha that we were discussing, the same wavelength that's in and through all life. The felt oneness is a real oneness. They grew up, they had children. The parent generation, again, those who developed a strong spiritual life gave off alpha. And the felt experience of oneness was a real oneness with all life. They then had children who are now moving from 16 to 18 to 20, late adolescence into emerging adulthood. And what we're finding in the 3rd generation from the same families, from the same neighborhoods, from the same variables all the way around is no alpha.
Yeah.
And it seems that the lack of deep, quiet moments to reflect, sitting at the bus stop, and when the bus is 40 minutes late, kicking around some thoughts, then getting bored, then maybe breaking through and starting to wonder, or seeing suddenly in a blade of grass the universe, or making a prayer, thinking about your grandparent. That is preempted by this, the phone. And constant distraction, irrespective of content, may indeed be short-circuiting the type of imperative developmental work of spiritual emergence that happens between 16 and 24. That's a real loss. I mean, that is probably the worst thing I could possibly see happening in the next generation, is people without that deep felt awakened awareness to look more deeply into life when the skies are rocky, when the waves are coming, people who can't draw into dialogue with life. Now, the good news is that this is hardwired. It's always there, but there's no better time to strengthen awakened awareness than in late adolescence and emerging adulthood.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. When I was that age, I worked in the fields. And so every morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'd watch the sunrise from the field. And basically they dropped me off in the field and I wouldn't see another person for like 8 hours. So I was there completely by myself, and I never thought of it, but maybe that was the beginning of being a priest, was right there, because
Malcolm, that is the story. In the Awakened Brain, I tell 6 stories of leaders such as yourself, people who just, as you so generously shared, Malcolm, shared their formation stories. Steve Rockefeller, who wrote the Earth's Charter, right, bringing effectively human rights extended to all living beings, ratified by the UN, by every country except the US, right? The Earth's Charter, that life itself, all nature has rights. That came to him through long hours, quiet hours at 5 a.m, working in the national parks, building trails, clearing passageways. And Tim Shriver talks about, being a Kennedy and wondering what he's supposed to do, and then sitting there in the chapel looking at a saint on the wall and saying, wow, that guy, he just loved people. He loved people. And then he, of course, went on finding that love was his path, to build the Special Olympics, where we're all known.
Yeah.
So the story you tell, Malcolm, is the story of emerging adulthood that is our spiritual formation, our lead foot for our life's work, our calling. That is the most important work we do in late adolescence and emerging adulthood. And for that to be foreclosed by the treadmill or the phone or a culture that doesn't give time to the deeper look at life is to rob that person of their path, their calling, their greatest contribution.
Yeah. We have so many questions that are coming in from our guests. Here's a you can remember we did that before. Everybody, we'd hand out little cards and they write their questions on them. So this is like the internet version of that. So here's a question. In 2010, when I was hit by a car, a great avenue of healing was being a study subject in an MRI for a UCSF doctor. I knew the research science would help others. What are some examples of repair in the path of brain and spirit?
Beautiful. So I'll tell a story. Beautiful. First of all, thank you for sharing in such a generous and open-handed way a pivotal moment in your life. Yeah. Thank you. And that is an honor for us. I'll share with you a couple studies. Very often it is through suffering that we deepen our spiritual awareness. So we looked at people, mean age 26, who had a deep, strong spirituality. They said, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. It's how I look into life daily. It's the land. It's really the bedrock. Those people were 2.5 times more likely to have suffered intensely, to have met criteria for major depression over the past 10 years. Through the dark tunnel of depression, they made it through the other side to the light, deepened, looked more deeply into the nature of life, felt it all sort of give way, the suffering, to God's presence, felt that they were always held and loved, that they had been guided. Once that spiritual core was formed, they were protected against recurrence at a rate of 75% for the next 10 years. So this extraordinary resource, this capacity to feel God's guidance and realize that red door stuck, and only because it stuck, God showed me this yellow door. So this bigger view of life comes through suffering. And once we build it, we're not just armored against recurrence, but life is far more expansive and full of promise than we might have ever imagined. Suffering is the doorway to awakening. And once we cross through, we don't go back.
Yeah, so much of what we're talking about feels like the 20s for me, that decade, that defining decade between, that when you're figuring out what it is that you stand for. But here's another question. Parents are struggling with maybe this is a statement. Parents are struggling with attempts to regulate the amount of time invested by teens in their technology. This is causing dysregulation in the family and strong aggressiveness in teens toward parents. Parents feel they are held hostage by their teens and the interaction they insist on with the technology. I'm a therapist with additional certification in neuropsychology. So that's kind of an interesting comment on that. Another question we have is, a lot of religious instruction of children has operated on the assumption that children are tabula rasa spiritually. Can you say more about how we can recognize and support the natural spirituality of children?
Beautiful. Yes, there's been beautiful research done. I share some of it in the awakened brain and some of it in the spiritual child. Let me share a few studies with you. A group of scientists asked parents and children, just naturally, go about your lives, but hey, parents, here's a journal. And every time you have a conversation with your child in the next 2 weeks that is about spirituality, could you just write down a note for us? So this was a very organically fluid study, nothing contrived, just keep a journal of spiritual conversations, mom and dad. And what they found was that in week 1, most of the conversations had been initiated by the parents. But once it became clear to the child that in our family, this is real, we talk about spirituality here, in week 2, the majority of the conversations were initiated by the child. So when we as parents speak openly about our spiritual life and talk about God, pray out loud, say the sunset is so moving, I feel that God's given us a gift right here now to look up and be together under the sunset. When we run a narrative that's authentic, our children know that, yes, this is real, and we talk about it in our family. It becomes part of our bond. That was the first finding. The second series of studies I want to highlight have to do with what the scientists called implicit spiritual cognition, meaning the child is born seen this way unless socialized out of it. And, we could give this other language, right? Souls on earth innately, but this is what is implicit spiritual cognition included: a tendency to see continuity of spirit or consciousness after death, unless taught otherwise. The capacity to spontaneously know, inspiration, mystical awareness, without being told as hard data, as real knowing. Right? The child is born a knower, and we can support our children in the validity of this awareness by simply taking an interest and saying, wow, yes, I understand. That makes sense. I'll give a story very quickly. When my oldest child, Isaiah, was about 2, our family faced the loss of his great-grandpa, our grandparent. And so sitting there graveside, we did what in the Jewish tradition is done, which is we each took a shovel of earth and put it on the casket. But Isaiah, being only 2, he took a little garden spade and put earth on Pop-Pop's casket. And when Isaiah did this, he said, look, mommy, the body goes back to the good earth. The soul goes to God. It was clear. It was spontaneous knowing. 2 weeks later, we're out in the backyard. Mommy, come here now. And when 2-year-olds say now, we move, right? So he pulls me out. We go way into the backyard and we discover there's a turkey carcass, a dead turkey. And he says, you see, mommy, the body goes back to the good earth. The soul goes to God. That funeral had been a time of immediate, clear perception of the continuity of spirit consciousness after death. Yes. All we have to say is yes, or tell a story of how we have experienced something like that too. But we don't need to be great theologians. We don't need to know everything. We only need to really honor their experience.
And that's why I always feel about parents feel like you have to be an expert or something and know biblical Greek in order to be able to talk about religion. But it's so much. We have a curriculum called Godly Play, and basically it's built around wondering time. And I love that idea of just when I was a chaplain and started a school, we had wondering time for every single grade, and it was a chance to just do exactly that, explore some of these questions and see which direction the children bring us.
As a parent, we need one word, and it's wow.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, it's a spirit of invitation.
Oh, beautifully put. Yes. And very often children, when they ask a question, aren't expecting or really wanting an answer. They're opening something up for wonder, for exploration. So, mommy, why is it that there are evil people on earth when God created everybody?
Yeah.
Wow. I don't need to know that answer, right? Yeah, and sometimes there are questions, I share this in the Awakened Brain about their own lives, right? So my oldest child, Isaiah, we adopted. It was a great blessing from an orphanage.
Such a great story. I love that story.
North of St. Petersburg, Russia, when he was a little baby, 10 months old. And as every parent knows who finds their spiritual child through adoption, it is a sacred pilgrimage to find your child. So that was the story we would tell Isaiah. Mommy prayed for Isaiah, daddy prayed for Isaiah, and Pop-Pop, who then passed, prayed, and grandma. Then we took a plane to a train to an automobile because he's young. Wow. And there was Isaiah. We'd throw him in the air and celebrate the Finding Isaiah pilgrimage story until he was about 4. And then we'd say, Isaiah, you are our baby Moses. We live by a little creek in our backyard. We said, Isaiah, you came down the river to us. You're our baby Moses. And he'd say, yes, I am baby Moses. And that held until he was about 8. And one day I'm driving in the car, everything we know as parents happens in the back seat. Yes. And I hear, Mama, Jack says, you are not my mama. Exactly. My name is not Miller. And I am not Jewish. And I said, oh, but Isaiah, don't you remember? And he said, oh, that's right. And he whips his head over to Jack and he says, I'm baby Moses. And Jack says, what? And he says, well, I'm baby Moses. And they go, He says, Mama, Jack says, what about the woman who gave me up? Okay, now I know as a psychologist that this has been handled abysmally by my field.
Yes, right.
So I take a deep breath. Oh, from the back seat. I know. God whispered in her ear and said that you were crying for me.
Yeah, yeah.
The child's a knower, and the most painful challenges and the biggest questions in their lives have a spiritual response that is far more expansive and joyous and buoyant and godly, right?
Yeah.
So when we treat them as spiritual knowers, and when we tell our family stories as the spiritual stories we see them to be, the Finding Isaiah story, the baby Moses story on our little backyard creek, they look into all of life with their natural gift, their natural endowment of awakened awareness, of spiritual knowing.
Yeah, it's straight. I love the stories in the book, those stories that were in the book. It was such a lovely balance. I loved having the section on, the quantum view of the universe, and I love the sections that about your story. And I love the hearing the sections that were about the latest developments in this field. That's just so important. I can imagine a future where human beings allow themselves to be spiritual again. And it's partly because of the work that you're doing.
Well, it's all hands on deck, and you have led the way with grace, Malcolm. It is really extraordinary, an actualized, awakened community.
Yeah, what a blessing for me to be able to come and be part of it. I can't believe that we've run out of time. Please join me next week when my guest will be historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. We'll be talking about her new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. We rely on your support to the forum. Gifts of any size can make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, THINK, to 76278. And Lisa, I don't even want to hang up because I just enjoyed this moment with you. Has been such a blessing. I mean,
Such a
all day
joy,
long.
Malcolm. Thank you. It's
Yeah.
just such a wonderful gift. Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope next time we see you, it'll be on the East Coast. I'll come to one of your lectures there or something when we are traveling again.
Oh, do you know what we're doing, Malcolm? On April 1st, I'll send the information to you. We're supporting high schools and colleges in creating what we're calling Awaken Campus, supporting as the work you're already doing.
Yeah.
Spiritual growth in places where our youth connect. So the Awakened Brain in the back has references for the science. Throughout it has practices, and we're applying these practices to college campuses.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. All right. Well, God bless you, Lisa, and take care. It's so good to see you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Malcolm.